Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Daily Dose. My name is Pastor Maddie, Elliot, and I serve as the Executive Director out at LutherCrest Bible Camp in Alexandria. And I'm so thrilled to have been with you this week in the Daily Dose as we talked about who God has created us to be. It's the theme that we are using out at summer camp, created to be. Who has God created us to be? Well, a couple of years ago, in the midst of COVID land, my dad was living here in Alexandria. And if you've heard my story before, you know that my dad had early onset of dementia. It was a dementia called Lewy body, and it was just this evil, evil disease. And so we moved him up to Alexandria to be closer to me and my sister, who also lives in Alexandria, and we were his caretakers during his time that he lived in Alexandria. And if you've been a caretaker of small people that you're raising, or your grown-ups, your parents or other caregivers, you know that it comes with a lot of responsibility, lots of setting up of appointments and medications and phone calls at weird hours. And at one point during COVID, it was just when we were starting to be allowed to go visit our loved ones in care facilities again, as long as we did it in certain ways. I began to get many phone calls from my dad, almost on a daily basis, being like, hey, I need you to come get me, or I need you to come get this from the store, or I need you to come fix my remote, or I need something else. And after a while, I started to feel burdened. You see, I was a young mom, and I was in school, and I had a full-time job, and it was COVID. Times were absurd. And I started to feel a little burdened by the amount of requests that my dad was making, sometimes multiples in one day. But I felt so obligated to keep showing up for my dad, and so I kept going over, and then I kept being full of a little more resentment. And when I would see his name pop up on my phone, I would do this. Would take a deep breath because I knew I had to get in the right mental state. See, being with my dad was kind of hard. Our relationship had changed as his body and his mind changed. But his calls were becoming so disruptive to my day. They were becoming so disruptive, and I started to view it as a burden instead of a joy that I got to take care of my dad. Well, it was during that time where a doctor came to us and said, hey, Maddie, I think we're entering into your dad's final stage of life. I knew it was coming, but I didn't know it was coming so soon. I was shocked, and I was full of regret that this burden, this disruption that I had been feeling, I would give anything to go back to it. Well, there are all kinds of disruptions that happen in our lives and that God puts in our way, and all kinds of disruptions that we as God's people can offer to the world around us. One that happens in Scripture is one that's pretty powerful. Jesus is leading his disciples, and he comes across a temple where outside the temple, they're like selling stuff. They've like set up all these tables, and they're selling stuff outside the temple instead of having the temple just be a space to worship God. And Jesus was really angered by this. He's so angered that he totally disrupts the whole system by flipping the tables over. Can you imagine that? Jesus flipping the tables over. You see, sometimes God calls us to be disruptive. God calls us to make a disruption, to tell a story, to speak up for injustice, or to look out for people on the margins, or sometimes to look out for ourselves. And when those disruptions happen, we often meet them with a little bit of anger or resentment. Can you think of a disruption that's happened in the United States or Minnesota, or maybe our town in Alexandria? Something that happened that maybe you met with anger or disgust. But maybe God was calling us to notice something, to notice a people who needed to be cared for, notice something that was an injustice, notice someone who was being forgotten about. Because God calls us to love God's people, to notice the disruptions and to pay attention. And instead of walking away in disgust or thinking of it as a burden that we exist with, instead God asks us to lean in, to wonder about the disruption, and when we're able, to be disruptive, to call out where we need to for justice and for love. So I'll leave you this week with one more time our verse that we're talking about at Bible camp this summer, and that is that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Fearfully and wonderfully made to be disruptive. Thanks for joining us this week.